And welcome to the Emergency Solutions Grant Program Training and Overview. The purpose of this presentation is to provide a brief overview of the Emergency Solutions Grant Program, the different uh, categories and eligible expenses that it can be used to serve your community. And we will also go into the budget application, the funding application, and various required IR or implementation report documents needed to administer the program. So the topics that we will cover, again, this will be a general overview where we're going to talk about, what is the purpose of the Emergency Solutions Grant Program? Um, what are the different categorical expenses? What are the restrictions that are placed on this program? And things of that nature. We'll go over the different expense categories, and the eligible costs and the required minimum standards per category. And then we will go into detail about the funding application and the budget application for the master grant agreement. So part 1, general overview. So this is language actually taken from the regulations of the Emergency Solutions Grant, the applicability and purpose of the program. I will leave it up here for you to read. But if you also just want to go look on your own, you can find it at 24 CFR 576.1. Yeah, so generally the purpose of the program, it's implemented as authorized under the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act. It authorizes the Department of Housing and Urban Planning, this program authorizes the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, to make grants available to states and other general purpose local governments and territories to provide emergency shelter activities, street outreach activities, homelessness prevention, rapid rehousing assistance, and recipients can also use this funding to operate and contribute data into HMIS. All right, so we'll go more into detail about the budget and allocation later in the presentation, but just as a brief overview, I just wanted to let you guys know kind of how OHCS allocates funds to all of the community action agencies across the state. So we use the following criteria weights to determine, how much funding each community action agency receives. Severe housing burden, so like the number of people in your community who are severely burdened with the cost of housing, that's like 30% of your allocation. The poverty rates in your communities is 45% of your allocation, and then the number of people experiencing homelessness is 25% of your allocation. So that is how we determine how each CAA receives funding, with a couple of caveats. So if there is a community, like a local government or like a city within your region that receives ESG funding directly from HUD, we actually exclude that region from these criteria weights. And the reason for that is to make sure that we're serving all areas of the state. So for example, I believe last year the city of Portland received ESG funding directly from HUD. So whenever we determine Multnomah County's when we determine Multnomah County's allocation, we excluded people that were living in Portland, and we looked at the rest of Multnomah County, right? So we looked at Gresham, we looked at Troutdale, Fairview, etc. And once we allocate funds to you, the CAAs, y'all generally are able to allocate fundings to the categories of your choice. There are a couple of restrictions. So admin is currently limited to 2.5% of your total allocation. And then your shelter and street outreach categories combined uh, cannot be more than 60% of your total allocation. That is a requirement that is kind of placed on OHCS as a whole. And so we put that restriction on the CAs to make sure that we're being fair and equitable. There are exceptions to the shelter and street outreach budget limit that we will go over at a later point in this presentation. Okay, so now we're going to go into more detail about the expense categories. We'll start with the HMIS, formerly known as data collection, but for the 25-27 biennium, we're going to be referring to it as HMIS. So it's a pretty simple category. It can pay for the cost of contributing data to the HMIS designated by your local continuum of care. So some general things that it can pay for is like software, hardware, staff time, equipment, office space, travel, and how to prove trainings for the purpose of collecting and inputting data into HMIS. So anything that's needed to contribute data into HMIS can generally go under this category. Sorry, I'm just going to go back one more time. There's no written standards that are required for you to follow for this one. So yeah, it's probably the most straightforward category of the groups. Now we're going to go into street outreach. So street outreach, as I mentioned before, is limited to 60% of your budget minus the emergency shelter allocation. So if you decide to allocate, let's say, 30% of your budget to emergency shelter, you could only allocate up to 30% for street outreach, and vice versa. And it can pay for service delivery for the specific purpose of reaching out to unsheltered homeless people, connecting them with emergency shelter, housing, or critical services, and then providing non-urgent or urgent non-facility based care. So allowable costs include like engagement services, case management, emergency health, and transportation. And there is this requirement that applies to general local purpose governments. So basically your county CAAs. Um, so you're generally not able to use ESG funds to replace local government funding that's provided for street outreach. You can add to it, certainly. You can expand current programs. You can, do all of that stuff. But if your county allocates money for the specific purpose of street outreach, ESG cannot go in and replace that. This program was originally intended, I believe, to be like a supplemental program by HUD. So, there's elements of that kind of throughout the program you'll see. Okay, so the required minimum written standards for street outreach, these are the titles of them, and they are located in the ESG manual. So, there may be some flexibility in there. Where there can be flexibility for the CAs, we grant it. Otherwise, OHCS sets the minimum written standards and says, if you're going to accept this program, these are the standards that you need to follow. So the title of the first one is Evaluating Eligibility for Assistance under the ESG program, Targeting and Providing Essential Services Related to Street Outreach, and coordination among, that is a typo, I apologize, but coordination among emergency shelter providers, essential service providers, homelessness prevention, rapid rehousing assistance providers, other homeless assistance providers, and mainstream services and housing providers. So, yeah, like I said, these minimum written standards are fleshed out in the manual. I just wanted to provide this for you so that, if you're providing street outreach services, you can kind of skip to those standards. In the new manual, we also created this table that has all the written standards laid out and then each category that it applies to, just to make it kind of easier to navigate. So now we're going to go into emergency shelter. As I mentioned with street outreach, you're limited to 60% of your budget minus the street outreach allocation, right? So if you decided to allocate 50% of your budget to street outreach, then you really only have 10% to work with for emergency shelter. And it can pay for the following. So it can pay for shelter services, shelter operations, so anything needed to like operate a shelter, right? Like rent or electricity, those sorts of things. Services are things that you provide actually to clients or those that are, you know, in the shelter at the time. It can also pay for renovation, rehab, and conversion, not acquisition, but it can pay for reno, rehab, and conversion. So if you're going to renovate, do like major renovations to a shelter, rehabilitate a building for a shelter, or convert a building into a shelter, ESG can help pay for that. There are restrictions that we'll go over, but that is a tool that you guys could use. And then this is a rare one, but it can also pay for assistance required under the Uniform Relocation Act. Um, so that is, the URA is basically like an anti-displacement law. Um, so, if you are using ESG funds to rehabilitate or convert a shelter, and that might like displace people in the community, um, ESG can pay to help relocate those people. And then again, similarly with street outreach, there is a maintaining support section, which is, again, it only applies to units of general purpose local governments, such as counties. But it basically states that funds may not be used to replace local government funds that are provided for emergency shelter. So again, this category can add to the budget of a local county government, but it can't replace the funds that a local county government allocates to shelter. So just think it can add, it can't replace, if that helps at all. And I just wanted to go into a little more detail on the essential services that it can pay for. It's all fleshed out in the manual, but these are kind of like the high level categories. So, case management, childcare, education services, etc. Um, if you want more specifics on these specific, subcategories of emergency shelter, I again would go into the manual. It fleshes out, all the different criteria and, eligible expenses within each of these different categories. Operations, same thing. Again, anything used to kind of operate a shelter. With this one exception, hotel or motel vouchers are considered part of operations. So that is if someone comes to you and there's no shelter available for a family or participant, you can provide hotel motel vouchers to them. And then again, just to kind of go over the Uniform Relocation Act, this is, it's designed to help with anti-displacement. It's very rare. I don't know how often I've seen this come across, but I did want to just kind of bring it to everyone's attention. Um, so it can provide for assistance for people that are displaced. Um, CAs need only provide payment necessary to relocate. Um, so like you can limit the amount of assistance that you give someone to just like whatever's necessary to help relocate them. And then they have a specific definition for displaced person. It includes individuals, it includes families, households, but it also includes businesses, nonprofits, farms, organizations, corporations, anything of that matter. Um, so yeah, and it kind of goes into like the specifics of like what a displaced person is, if it's like a permanent displacement versus temporary. So I would really encourage all of you to look further into this. And if there comes a point where you need to use ESG for this purpose, you can always contact me and we can work on it together. So yeah, always contact me for more information. I'm happy and available if needed. And then the reno rehab conversion expenses. So, yeah, So like I said, you can use ESG funds for reno rehab or conversion. There are some caveats, like for one, the shelter has to be owned by either the government or a nonprofit. So basically, like you as the CAA, you need to own the building. Um, if it's one of your subrecipients' buildings, I would encourage you to contact me, and then we can again work on that together. But it does need to be owned by at least a nonprofit or a government organization. You do need to receive prior approval from OHCS. So we have on the HSS dashboard, we actually have this approval request form that you fill out, that, we go through, we make sure, you give us the required information, and then we can, either approve the rental rehab conversion, or if it's missing some information or if we need more information, we'll let you know. But please, we need you to do this. Please do not try to do the rental rehab conversion and then ask for reimbursement at a later point. We would not be able to approve that. And I'm not in the business of wanting to disallow expenses, especially if your community needs it. So yeah, please follow the workflow. There's also a minimum period of use, so like a restrictive use period. So it's going to be either 10 or 3 years, kind of depending on what the situation is. So if the total rehabilitation cost exceeds 75% of the value of the building before rehabilitation, then you need to keep it operating as an emergency shelter for a minimum period of 10 years. And again, total rehabilitation cost is the key there. We actually got guidance from HUD that it's not just the ESG funding used to rehabilitate. It is if the sum of your funding streams to rehabilitate a building exceeds 75% of the value prior to rehabilitation, then you have to keep it operating as an emergency shelter for 10 years. And then similarly, if the total cost to convert a shelter exceeds 75% of the value of the building after conversion, then it has to be a shelter for 10 years. So again, total, all the funding streams, not just the ESG funding streams. And then in all other instances that you use ESG funds to rent a rehab or convert, it's a 3-year restrictive use period. So yeah, those are the two caveats for 10 years. Otherwise, it's 3 years. And also, the minimum use period must be enforced by a recorded deed or use restriction. So if you're not sure what that is, reach out to us and we will kind of help work through that with you. And then these are the minimum written standards for emergency shelter. Once again, you can find these fleshed out in the manual, but these are the titles of them. So evaluating eligibility for assistance under the ESG program, admission, diversion, referral, and discharge, assessing, prioritizing, and reassessing needs, and then coordination amongst ESG or emergency shelter providers, essential service providers, homelessness prevention, rapid rehousing, etc. And again, there's a table on the new ESG manual for the 25-27 biennium that kind of tells you, which written standards you need to follow if you're going to use ESG funding for shelter. So that was emergency shelter, and now we have homelessness prevention and rapid rehousing. I lumped these two together for this presentation because they do almost identical things, but for different purposes. So, homelessness prevention provides housing relocation and stabilization services and up to 24 months of rental assistance necessary to keep a family or participant housed, right? So if someone is on the verge of losing their housing and you want to keep them housed, you would use prevention services. For rapid rehousing, that is someone who is experiencing homelessness and you want to rapidly move them from like unsheltered homelessness or from an emergency shelter into a permanent housing situation. So And, the purpose is to help them like achieve stability. So again, prevention prevents someone from becoming homeless. Rapid rehousing takes someone who is experiencing homelessness, moves them into public housing. The purposes are different, but what they do is virtually identical. And these are the eligibility criteria. So I did not mention this, but for street outreach, someone needs to be experiencing unsheltered homelessness. So literal unsheltered homelessness in order to receive street outreach services. Emergency shelter, there actually is no eligibility criteria, as far as I'm aware. Um, and then homelessness prevention, um, you need to meet, these following definitions. So you need to either be at risk of homelessness, the imminent risk of homelessness, homeless under other statutes, or a domestic violence survivor. Um, in addition, if you're not meeting just the at risk of homelessness definition, but you're meeting any of the others, then you need to have an annual income that is below 30% of your area median income. Um, These definitions are defined in the ESG manual and they differ from the state's definitions of homelessness. That is because HUD has a specific definition that we have to use for this program, so it's going to be a little disjointed from state programs. So I would encourage you to look at the manual and check the eligibility requirements. And for rapid rehousing, the participant must meet the definition of literally homeless. So if they don't meet that literal definition, then they're not eligible. Like there's just one definition that they have to meet for rapid rehousing. And these are the housing relocation and stabilization services financial assistance. These are the different things that prevention rapid rehousing can provide. So rental application fees, security deposits with, maximum, the maximum security deposit can't be more than twice the rent. Last month's rent, if you do it for last month's rent, though, then it kind of counts against the participant for their 24 months of rental assistance under this program. So just keep that in mind. It can pay for utility deposits, utility payments, cost of moving, and the cost to break a lease if the participant is under an emergency transfer plan. And then housing relocation and stabilization services costs include search and replacement, housing stability case management, mediation, legal services, and credit repair. Please keep in mind that credit repair does not include the payment or modification of a debt. Um, it can pay for, let's say, classes and assistance and how they can, repair their credit, but it can't literally like pay off their debts for them. And some more on rental assistance. So, as I mentioned before, the rental assistance is for up to 24 months. Technically, if it's 3 months or less, it's considered short-term rental assistance. Anything longer than that is medium. Anything longer than that and up to 24 is medium-term rental assistance. It can also pay for arrears of up to 6 months, including any late fees. If there's a fee to break a lease and the program participant is under an emergency transfer plan, it can pay for that as well. I would encourage you all to look at the manual to check out more information about the emergency transfer plan. And then the assistance can either be tenant-based or project-based. Tenant-based is generally, the tenant selects the housing of their choice. Subgrantees do have the authority to limit where the participant can live, um, particularly if they're receiving some sort of case management or other sorts of services. Um, it might just make more sense to kind of have them in a specific location, um, so that they can receive those services easier. But yeah, that is to the subgrantee's discretion. Um, and then project based. So let's say that you as a subgrantee, you find a unit that's like eligible for ESG funding, so it meets fair market rent requirements and it meets habitability standards, etc. But you don't have a participant living there yet, you can enter into agreement with the landlord to reserve the unit for when someone walks through the door and needs assistance. Um, there are some restrictions on that are fleshed out in the manual. Um, I believe, like with the project-based assistance, for example, I don't believe you can start paying the rent until you find a participant. But I would review the manual, and yeah, make sure that you're meeting all the different requirements. So here are some general restrictions on rental assistance. So the first one is, subgrantee may not terminate or otherwise end or reduce a participant's rental assistance as long as they remain eligible. So if someone remains eligible for rental assistance under the ESG program, they need to stay on the program. Um, there is a caveat that, if you need to move them over to another funding stream, that's fine. Um, Particularly, like, let's say the ESG program, you're running out of funding for that, and they're just, they're still eligible, but the funding's not there, then you can move them over to another program, and then if all else fails, then you can, terminate their assistance. Um, so the rental unit must not exceed fair market rent as established by HUD. So HUD publishes on their website the fair market rent each year for each county. So the rent just needs to be at or below fair market rent in order for ESG to uh, be able to subsidize that rent. It must also be reasonable based on rents of comparable units. So what that means is that a landlord can't charge you as, the subgrantee putting someone in that housing. It can't charge y'all something different from what it would charge a different participant. It can't charge anything more, basically. So you need to make sure the rent's reasonable. There's also certain protections and provisions that the rental agreement must include. Again, it's all in the ESG manual, and the tenant contribution is $0. While they're on this program, they pay $0 toward rental assistance. And these are the minimum written standards. So, evaluating eligibility for assistance under the ESG program, coordination amongst all these providers. This is the coordination standard kind of applies like throughout the ESG program. Um, so yeah, I just put it on all the slides. Determining and prioritizing eligibility for homelessness prevention assistance and rapid rehousing assistance, determining participant share of rent and utilities, duration and amount of rental assistance, and then determining type, amount, and duration of housing stabilization and relocation assistance. Once again, these are all fleshed out in the manual. I encourage you to review them. So those are all of the requirements for ESG. If you want to go into any of them with greater detail with me, I'm happy to do so. Please feel free to reach out. But for this presentation, we're going to move on to the match requirement. So as I've mentioned before, the purpose of the ESG program is really to be a supplemental program to work that you and your community is already doing. So another way that kind of, HUD has established this as a supplemental program is by this matching requirement. So subgrantees need to match 100% of your fiscal year allocation. Yeah, and the match must meet the following requirements. So this is these following requirements are found in 2 CFR 200. I thought I included the citation. I did not, but yeah, they're in 2 CFR 200. So it has to be verifiable in your records. It cannot be included as match for any other federal award, so no double matching. necessary and reasonable for achieving the objectives of the ESG program. And it must be allowable under 2 CFR 200 subpart E. So I would encourage you to review 2 CFR 200 if needed, or get with your fiscal people. But yeah, so those are the match requirements. Additionally, the expenditure must be on an allowable ESG expense. So a good rule of thumb for match is if there's a funding stream that, you know, you could use for ESG, but you use it for something else, that could count as match for you. The other thing is that it's not subject to the admin, shelter, or street outreach expenditure limits. So if you wanted to match ESG with 100% shelter or 100% street outreach or like, 30 or 40% admin, you could do that. Yeah, HUD really just wants to see that you are basically providing these services to your community. Contributions may also be either cash or in kind. So cash contributions are exactly what it says, cash. In-kind contribution is like the value of a good or a service. So if someone donated a building for you to provide ESG services, then that could count as an in-kind contribution. If someone volunteers at a shelter, I mean, their time could be counted as an in-kind contribution. So things like that. The last piece that I did not talk about here is the match needs to occur within the ESG's performance period. So the performance period is generally your expenditure period in Opus. Right? So like the start of the grant, which is usually July 1st, to the end of the performance period, which is usually about 24 months after that. So it just needs to occur within that 24-month window to count as match. And these are the requirements for the waiver. So if you're not able to meet match, OHCS does have the ability to waive up to 100,000 for each fiscal year allocation. We have to pass it along to the subgrantee least capable of meeting the match requirements, however. So what we did was we created a match waiver request form. It's on the HSS dashboard. In the request form, we basically ask for you to explain why you're requesting the waiver. If you can include any data, information, and context, please include all of that. The more information we have, the quicker and easier it is for us to make a determination. And also the more likely it is that you will be granted that waiver. So we need to basically make sure that if you're getting a waiver, it's for a reason that is uniquely specific to your region. And, it can't be something like this is a difficult program to match or, their requirements are hard. Like that's something that's kind of universal across the board. So really speak to how you as an agency are uniquely unable to meet the match requirements. The other thing too is that the waiver is limited and we have to ration it out, right? So what we do is we generally waive up to $25,000 per calendar year quarter. That you can still request multiple waivers and receive approval for all of those waivers, but we try to limit it that much. If in the previous quarter, no one requested or received a waiver, then we could increase next quarter's waiver to like a 50,000 or something like that. But yeah, those are that is just a way that we make sure that we're being fair and equitable. Also, situations change. 2 years is both not a long time at all and a very long time. So yeah, but yeah, just submit as many waivers as you need and we can continue to either approve or deny them. And if you need help, again, contact me and I can kind of offer assistance there. The other thing too is we need you to submit the waiver before the end of the grant's expenditure period. If the expenditure period's over and you haven't been matching this whole time, and then you try to come to me and ask for a waiver after the fact, we're not able to approve that. That waiver request should have come in well before then. And it could require OHCS to take certain actions, such as requiring the repayment of all those ESG funds, or it could, require like other actions, like requiring you to match more upfront. Um, so yeah, just please keep that in mind. And then this is the quarterly expenditure and match report. I send it out at the end of each calendar quarter. So I make the reports available on the following days: April 1st, July 1st, October 1st, and then January 2nd. Not January 1st because we're off on that day. And also, if any of these days fall on like a weekend or a holiday, then we'll make it available generally the next business day. If I can do it before, I will. Um, but yeah, please keep that in mind. And then, you know, so we make it available around the first of the month, and then we ask you to submit it no later than the end of that same month. So April 30th, July 31st, October 31st, January 31st. The caveat being, of course, if any of those days fall on a weekend or a holiday, then generally we'll require it just the next business day. Um, January, maybe we'll ask for it beforehand just because that's whenever we have to send it all to HUD. But if I can do the next business day for y'all, then we'll require the next business day. Okay, so those are the high level eligible expenses, categories, and match requirements. Those are kind of the big pieces of the program. There's other caveats and other requirements that we did not go into that the manual does. And, as you work on this grant and program, I encourage you to review that manual and make sure that you are, following it. And if anything's unclear, then please reach out to me so that we can provide clarity. Now we're going to go into the master grant agreement piece of this presentation. So the required documents. This is part of what's called the funding application. So basically, if you want to receive funding for the ESG program, then you need to submit these 3 documents as it applies to you. So required document number 1 applies to all subgrantees. So it's just COC approval. It's needed to show compliance with ESG requirements to coordinate and integrate ESG activities with like mainstream housing, health, employment, education programs, etc. So yeah, it's an approval form. It's basically just a signed form from that you get from your COC. You get it on the OHCS website. You send it to the COC for approval, and then you give it to us. The required document number 2 is local government approval, and this applies to any subgrantees that are nonprofits. So if you're a county subgrantee, you can ignore this one. And also, if you're a nonprofit and you are not using ESG funds for shelter activities, you can also ignore this. But if you're a nonprofit and you're using ESG funds for shelter activities, then you need an approval from each county in which you're using the funds for the shelter. So for some nonprofits, this could be straightforward because you only serve one county. Other nonprofits, if you're spanning 3 or 4 counties, you need approval from each of those counties in which you're providing shelter services. Well, not just services, but anything to do with emergency shelter. And again, if you're a nonprofit and you are not using ESG funds for shelter, then this would not apply to you, so you do not need to fill it out. Please know, however, that if you ever want to use ESG funds for shelter moving forward, then we would need to get this from you before we can approve any like budget change requests or anything like that. Required document number 3 It applies to county level subgrantees, which I believe there's only two, but if there are more, it applies to you as well. So this is basically just a document stating that you will not use ESG funds to replace existing funding for shelter and street outreach activities. Um, yeah, it's just a document. You sign it. You're saying, I agree that I will not do this, and then you turn it into us. And each of these documents are good for one biennium. So, yeah, you give this to us, and it's good for the entirety of the biennium, which usually means it's good for, you know, each ESG allocation that's given within that biennium. So those are the funding application pieces. It's pretty straightforward, there's no policy or document that we require you to fill out and send for ESG approval. Yeah, it's just basically all self-attestation documents and all, signed documents from your COC, etc. So that's the funding application. And then once that's approved, then you can submit what's called the budget application. And that is just the, how much funding are you going to put in each category? How quickly are you going to spend the funds each quarter? That is the budget application. As I mentioned before, there are certain limitations. So admin, 2.5% of your allocation can go to admin. We usually give you the specific dollar amounts in the allocation tables each fiscal year, so you don't need to guess. You can just look it up. Shelter and street outreach, the combined total cannot be more than 60% of your allocation. There is an exception, however, that we've built in. So we've built in a shelter street outreach request, budget request, to kind of go more than to have more than 60% of your budget allocated to those two categories. And I think there's a slide after this that actually goes into it a bit more. So I'll wait on that. And yeah, the other piece is that, we need your budget to be approved or submitted to OHCS by the 60th day after we receive the allocation from HUD. If you don't give it to us by that 60th day, then we'll assign a budget to you. And, you can always go back and send a budget change request to change it. But basically, there's a requirement from HUD that we have to obligate our funding, 100% of our funding to subgrantees by the 60th day. So either tell us what you want the budget to be, or we'll have to assign it for you. I'll usually try to make it match whatever last year's budget allocation was, to the extent possible. If I can't for whatever reason, then I'll let you know. And then if you're a county level government, you need to subgrant all of your allocation to your subrecipients no later than 120 days after we give you the award, right? So after OHCS allocates the award to, Multnomah County or Lane County, for example, y'all then need to subgrant it out to your subrecipients no later than 120 days later. So here is the budget limit exception for shelter and street outreach. So number one, it's subject to funding availability. If there's no room to extend beyond that 60%, then we can't approve it. If there is room in our budget to say, yeah, we can let you go up to maybe 70% or 80%, then we'll do it. This is just a way to make it more fair and equitable. So that it's not like, first come, first serve. So we need you to answer the following questions. What goods or services do you plan to provide? How many individuals or families do you plan to serve with the extra funding? How many projects will operate as a result of the increased budget? And then if we can't grant the exception, basically, what is your backup plan? How do you plan to maintain goods and services within your community? So if this is a route you want to take, then you'll need to submit an alternative budget in case OHCS cannot grant the exception. So submit your desired budget first, and then if you're, wanting an exception, there's like a box that you check on the budget application. You answer these questions, and then it's, if you're not approved, what do you want your backup budget to be? So we need all those pieces filled out in order to determine whether we're able to grant you an exception. And that's it. So those are the major elements for the master grant agreement. Those are the major elements for the ESG program. If you have any questions or if you need any additional assistance, please contact me. My email's right here, Cody Sibley at hcs.oregon.gov. And I'll be, happy to assist you to the best of my ability. So thank you so much. And yeah, take care.